Hi, and welcome to Féile Youth Talks Back as part of the Féile on Football Spring Festival. I am journalist and columnist Allison Morris, and with me today are school principal and commentator Chris Donnelly, the recently appointed mental health champion Siobhan, and I'm also delighted to be joined by Irish and youth delegate Tara Grace Conley. I cannot think of any time in our recent history that an event like this was more needed or relevant. We know that over the last year, our children of young people have sacrificed so much. They've done so also with great resilience, despite losing out on so much education and social interaction, and let's face it, are the most formative years of most of our lives. So what I want to do is get straight down to sort of examining what impact this will have on the long term of those people's education. For those of you listening, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, if you just throw them into the Q&A box, the chat box is locked. So any questions, if you put them in there, and I'll make sure that I get to those as we go along. But I'm going to start with Chris. So Chris, what would you say is the greatest challenge facing young people in terms of their education as society hopefully heads into more normal times? And I would assume, given the rollout of the vaccine by September, we can at least expect that new term to start on a relatively normal footing. What do you see as the biggest challenges for young people in trying to get back into their education, given how much of it they've missed in the last 12 months?
Okay, thanks, Alison. I would hope, what you're saying and hoping as well, that by September we can expect to get the children back, and actually hope we're maybe able to do like we did last year, maybe by the middle of August or late August, bring the children back in and we'd have a good run. The only reason I'd be cautious is we thought that was going to happen last year, Alison, and of course, look what happened. We're right back smack in the middle of this. I think that there are many challenges is the answer. You know, obviously, when you look at any school's mission statement is going to talk about not just the academic development of the child, but it's going to talk about the social, emotional, the holistic formation of children. That's what we're about in schools. It's not just about the curriculum, teaching the curriculum. It's so much broader. And I think that was already a theme in education, that all schools have to be about what are you doing to develop children academically, but also this umbrella term that we would have pastorally, and that covers so many different bases. That was already such a theme in education prior to COVID. I think now there's going to be a real focus across every school as to how we can ensure that we are, looking across the full holistic development of children to see that over from August, September onwards, that we're remaining vigilant as to how children settling back into the classroom, how in terms of their socializing, do they seem to be settled? Do they seem to be happy? Most importantly, are they happy? Because anyone involved in education, any parent will tell you that if a child is not happy, they're not going to learn, Alison. So I think that's the most important thing. And I mean, I know we were talking before the show, and I'd mentioned that I've been meeting parents of children all this week, some by phone, and it's around primary sevens, and primary sevens have had a really torrid year this year. It really, I've always said it, primary seven, and I taught pre-7 for a long time, it's really the happiest year in primary school. It's the one you remember the most. And although we have an insanely archaic system of having still a test, but once you get past that test, primary 7, such a great year, you remember for the rest of your life. You go on, my own school, the children go on a residential. You have all sorts of trips. You have the end of year show. You have all those things. And for the second year in a row, that's really been denied for children. I mean, I'm really hopeful we can get the P7 kids as soon as possible. And I've been teachers, we're actually going to have sleepover in the school for our P7s, one class bubble at a time. It's going to be terrible. Adults like me, we're going to have a terrible time. But the kids will enjoy it. That's what will count. But, it's really, I think that, one of the things that as teachers and parents, we do think in the language that we wouldn't use in front of children. We do have to think, we don't want the children to lost learning in that sense. These are words that we wouldn't have conversations in front of children. Yeah. But you do worry, as a parent of a primary 1 or primary 2 child, they do worry, will my child have that, phonics development, words, are they going to struggle? But we need to be very, very careful with regard to our priorities and our planning, and also with the vocabulary you use in front of children and then in dialogues with parents and other professionals.
And obviously you're involved in primary school teaching. We know that a lot of parents that I have been speaking to are now starting to make a case to hold their children back for a year because they feel that they've just lost out on a full year of education. how realistic is that? I suppose, especially when it comes to the P7s, maybe the ones who have birthdays later on in the year and who just haven't matured socially enough to go into a post-primary setting. What would that do for the class numbers? And what you have spoke about a bit there is, I know that the Department of Education is saying that the emphasis should be on reconnecting when the children come back through, their play and the arts and all sorts of other things. But as a teacher, I suppose that the main instinct is to try and catch those children up on the work that they've lost as well, and any work of the ones who maybe didn't connect with the online learning as well as others. How do you think that those two things are going to sit alongside each other? And as you said, trying to get the children who have maybe lost some of their phonics, some of the things that they had learned in P1 and 2, as well as trying to make sure that those children are happy and settled and reconnected with their classmates?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. The priority is getting the children connected, getting the children familiar with the classroom environment, once again, with the teacher. I mean, you'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but I certainly am I've been talking to parents every day throughout this, calling one, seeing how they're getting on. And, some are saying that they've maybe been out walking with their child, and the child is walking past a peer, maybe it was in their class, and they're kind of recoiling. They're becoming shy once again, because it's been a period of time where they've been outside of the classroom. When the children get older, Alison, up towards P5, 6, 7, Xbox placed in, they're actually being fantastic things now for making sure that the kids are connecting, whatever games they're playing, they're talking to one another. I think that's really been crucial through this for many. Of course, there is a balance there, because there's other parents. I've one last night talking to this morning, said 3 o'clock in the morning, the child was on his PlayStation. Little wonder he didn't make it in for the key worker vulnerable people supervision this morning. But that's you've got all of these factors. And I think that the priority is getting the children back in. Like I've told my teachers, P1, P2, P3, there's no homework next week. It's getting the children in. We're hoping that weather's a wee bit better. We're starting a gardening project in the school, getting the children hopefully using the outdoors, using the structured play, getting them classroom, using circle time. But yes, you're right. I mean, parents will be anxious, teachers will be anxious to say, okay, but alongside that, we do need to be reintroducing the learning themes. We're going to have to revisit the learning themes. I mean, most children haven't been in the classroom since about the 17th, 18th of December at this point, and that's a long time. And the primary 4, 5, 6, 7s, it doesn't look like they're going to be until the middle of April. Yeah. That's a long period of time.
Siobhan, in terms of mental health, I know that the studies in relation to the impact of the pandemic on young people's mental health are still in their infancy. We're still obviously in the middle of it, and it's hard to sort of go through and see what the long-term effects are going to be. I know that most parents and most young people will know the obvious signs, or the signs of anxiety, people who it's affecting, eating disorders or self-harming and all those very severe aspects of when people's mental health is impacted by something like this. But there's also a whole range of much more subtle impacts as well, isn't there? I think Chris touched on some of it there, that sort of lack of social interaction, social awkwardness, maybe withdrawal, all of those sort of things, which I don't think any of us expected this to last as long as it has. But for some young people, especially maybe those living rurally or those who don't live close to their other peers, they've almost went a full year with only minor interaction and only a few months in school. What do you think the first priority should be in dealing with that? What are the warning signs of it, so that the young people maybe listening here know to watch out for their friends? And what do you think needs to be done about that going forward?
Okay, so you're absolutely right. The data is starting to come through, though, particularly around the first 2 lockdowns. We have a very solid body of evidence, and I'm looking here to review 27 studies. And the phrase the academics are actually using is that there was significant harm caused by closing school. That's a very strong term for academics to use. We're normally very, very measured. We don't exaggerate the impact of anything. And we do know that our young people are incredibly resilient, but they have been out of school. And it's not the being away from school, it's being away from their peers. That is having the impact on them. So we know that when children, and this is the important variable, when they've had the opportunity to socialize and when they can stay connected with their friends, actually the impact is not so bad. But it's the children that are isolated, and you hear really worrying reports of kids saying that they don't know if they'll have any friends left, if they don't know if their friends are still their friends. That's a level, and this is their whole world. Their whole world was taken from them, and now the schools have been closed for a very long period of time over the winter, and we know even that summer period in any year being away from school exacerbates those inequalities. The summer holiday experience is absolutely crucial. You know, the healthy food that kids would get when they're at school, the loss of that, the loss of physical activity. We know that children are much more sedentary now, and it's so important for their development and for their physical and their mental health, which is one and the same thing. You know, things like sleep has been affected. Yeah, and sleep is an indicator of general mental well-being. So when a kid loses out on sleep, it's a wee warning sign that things are not right and we need to start intervening there. So the data is showing us that there's significant distress and problems with emotional regulation in the face of anxiety. So kids get really anxious when they're separated from their peers. It's an anxiety-provoking experience. It's like if you have we're pack animals. If you have a wee animal and you remove them from the rest of the pack, then that is a really stressful experience for that animal, and it's the same for our children. So they will have responded in a way that they need to regulate that anxiety, they need to regulate that emotion. And for some children, the only way for them to do that is through things like controlling their eating behaviour, which is very, very dangerous. And 1 in 6 kids before the pandemic had engaged in that type of behaviour. And we know the rates of eating disorders they're increasing. And that's a really serious mental illness because of the death rate. It's the highest death rate of any mental illness. So that's a worrying sign. We also have reports of children and young people self-harming. Again, it's something they do to control that emotional impact of stress, but it's a really, really dangerous behaviour pattern. So what we're talking about here is behaviour to regulate rather than depression or anxiety per se, but we know that if these behaviours aren't addressed, then they will lead to significant mental health problems that will be much more difficult to overcome. So in terms of the response, and to answer your question properly, what should we be doing? Exactly what Chris is saying. It's about reconnecting, because the answer is, you do it through relationships. You build those relationships, you promote that regulation. So you get everybody together and you all chill out and you do your art, your music, your physical activity, and you have a laugh. And once you're doing that for a while, everything will start falling into place, and the children's emotional regulation will be a bit better, and then they'll be in a position to start to think about schoolwork. Now,
sorry, in terms of what you were saying there about us we are very sociable, animals, we work better if we're surrounded in people. I know that my Irish colleague Brenton Crossan has been going on about this quite a lot, about outdoor sports and youth sports, and the fact that many of the young people who are watching here today, their sporting activities, not just the training and the physical aspect of it, but that is their core group of friends, that is their social life, that is their social set and social circle. All of that comes with being involved in that organised sport. And we know that outside transmission is very rare, and that in controlled circumstances that can be managed. I mean, as someone who now has the ear of government in relation to children's mental health, is that something that you have been raising as should be a priority to get that organised sport back again as soon as possible, so that those young people can start meeting up in their groups in a healthy setting?
Yes, outdoor sports, physically, it ticks a lot of boxes, doesn't it? But the absolute priority has to be schools, because there's so many young people that don't engage in sports, and particularly girls. They do different things, they have different interests, and art and music and drama are important for those children and young people. So it's important that we all exercise, but that theoretically that's still possible, But the art, the music, everything that you get from being back at school is just so important. You can't buy that back in any other form, so getting children back to school must be the priority. And if it means we need to adjust all of those other actions. So I notice it's number 3 there, and I don't know if that's number 3 is in chronological, because they're going to be moving in different paces. Right, but this must be our priority. We cannot buy back this time. We can't replace this with money. There's no way of getting this time back. It just the schools need to be open ASAP. So yeah, outdoor sports, I have so much sympathy with that argument, and I would be saying as soon as possible, put it right up there. But once you start getting parents coming to centres and cars and people travelling, you've got groups of people outside and other other organizations are going to say, well, you know, what about our sport? You know, what about what we're doing outside? Should that not be allowed? And it kind of, I get the point. So there's a behavioral aspect to this. There's behavioral science, there's the science of the transmission of the virus, and then there's also the science around children's brain development, and all of those things have to be taken into consideration. But, you know, that regulation, that play, that time in the school with the parents. The problem though that we have right now is we've been talking about catch up for the last year, and now we're saying we shouldn't talk about catch up, and children are saying, but we're worried about catch up. We want to catch up. We think we're behind, you know. So we've got to find a way of acknowledging their concerns, but actually dealing with this and getting them to trust us again. The children and young people don't trust the adults that are in charge. That's half the problem. They don't feel that we have their backs. You know, that's what I'm hearing on the ground. They don't feel that we're making decisions in their best interest. So they're getting worried about things that children and young people shouldn't be getting worried about. So we need to bring back the trust. We need to get them back to school, and we need to foster those relationships so that everybody, you know, can do better through this.
I think a lot of the adults don't really trust the adults in charge at this stage either, so they're not alone. Tara, moving on, and this actually feeds in straight away to what I was going to ask you about not trusting the adults in charge. Last September, we had seen universities brought young people back in again at great expense when you talk about their fees in terms of their accommodation and all of the relocation fees that go with that. We've seen a lot of demonising of those young people in the press and in the media. And also then we could see very quickly that wasn't going to work out, and many of those young people have now been back at home using remote learning. That doesn't seem to me like pretty good value for money, and I'm sure any of the young people you're speaking to, is this one of the issues that has enraged them the most in how the adults have handled the pandemic?
Absolutely. I can speak to this in kind of two perspectives. One, as someone who engages with young people every day and talks and hear about their opinions, and then as someone who was up until December a student myself. So I've seen this from both ends of the equation. Now, there's absolutely always been a problem with the demonisation of young people, particularly that teenage age of people, you know, being rabble rousers and not obeying rules generally. I think that's really been exacerbated during COVID-19. You're seeing this whole this storyline of young people in house parties being these super spreaders, and students in the Holy Lands really causing the mass spreading of COVID in Belfast. I have to say, there is a degree of, you know, you have to abide by the restrictions, but I think to take away the context in which the students are existing really does a disservice, both to the students themselves, and also takes the blame off of private landlords that aren't willing to give students a rent break, who are privately renting houses in the Holy Lands and are stuck in the position where they have no choice but to stay in very cramped, crowded accommodation where a disease like COVID could rapidly spread. So that's one aspect of that issue. The delivery of education is another. And I think a really interesting place where you can see how this is such a massive issue is how we're currently in SU election season for NUSUSI, for Queen's and for Ulster. And you're seeing how typically the issues that would come up in SU elections is about, you know, free printing in the SU or other things around campus, whereas now you're seeing an awful lot of stuff about COVID welfare packages and welfare provision for students who have been failed, in terms of people that are now stuck in Elms and aren't able to travel home, where we have international students who have relocated their entire lives to come to Belfast and are now stuck up in Elms or in private housing and have no connection to the university community, haven't had a single class in person yet. And those people seem to really fall through the gaps. You don't really hear an awful lot about those people. And, you know, what you're saying about the demonisation of people in the media in particular, there was also a degree of demonisation of young people by politicians too. There's an awful lot of blame being laid at their feet.
I agree. And at one stage we were hearing politicians saying, don't be going home to your rural community and, you know, killing your granny at the weekend. And at the other hand, they were saying, but don't be running around the Holy Land. And you're going like, where is it these young people are meant to go? What is it that's expected of them? You know, they've already given so much. What is it you want? Because these are the young people who were working in hospitality and shops and supermarkets and all those other things during the start of the pandemic, while the rest of us were lovely and cozy, you know, at home. And I agree with you. There was a lot of politicians, I think, who spoke it in ways which will not endear them, I think, to the future voters of this world. Absolutely not.
There's actually a few points there that I want to touch on. Now I know this research is relevant to the South, and it's something I've been hearing an awful lot of from Republic of Ireland students, but how you said about a lot of young people making up those essential worker roles, supermarkets and part-time work, that young people have been disproportionately economically affected by the coronavirus, and that's something that research in the South, the ASRI, have been able to substantiate, that young people actually are disproportionately affected. And you said about how politicians are not endearing themselves to young people. The Northern Ireland Youth Forum's report, our voices, they said that 89% of young people feel like their voices haven't been heard at all by decision makers during COVID. And you mentioned this point of where are students supposed to go. There really does seem to be this issue of they fall in between the gaps. They're both young enough that they're still at the developmental stage of their life, that they're still in education, but they're old enough that they're expected to be able to take full responsibility for themselves economically. And I think a really important point of this, and before I finish at this point, I really want to pay tribute to the student movement and the student workers. The president of NUSI, Ellen Féirinn, QEBSU, USU, who pushed for the £500 payment for students, because that economic support for students is absolutely vital, and you weren't really seeing it coming from universities all that much, and that was a real lifeline for students, and those struggles seem to really be lost in the midst of all this, and that guilt tripping of students off, like you said, you're going to go kill your granny if you go home at the weekend. They're really stuck in the middle.
No, I agree. And as I said, in the very early days of the pandemic, when the streets were deserted and they were empty, and you went into the shop, it was a 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old person standing behind the counter in that shop serving us. And then, we fast forward to September, and those people were all of a sudden the enemy. The people who kept us all afloat during that. There's a great question here, which I think probably maybe Chris and Siobhan, I think, would be placed to answer in the chat box, saying, do all or any of yourselves think there should have been more support given to parents for homeschooling, especially within the primary school setting? Personally, I know my mum has been inundated with primary school work for my younger siblings and has had to take time off work to accommodate that. If this were to happen again, would you be proud to support parents who have had to take on the role of teachers this term? And I was very grateful that my children were not of school age, because I'm pretty sure I would have been a fairly awful teacher, had I been left to do any homeschooling. Chris, and this must be something that you have heard from parents who are struggling to juggle work, other children, older children, themselves under mental health stress because of the pandemic, and schoolwork that maybe they're struggling to try and help our young people with. Massively,
Alison. I'd say that it's been a tale of two lockdowns. If we look at last March to June, it was, if you recall, we didn't know what we were getting in for, and the weather was good, if you remember, for such a long stretch of that. And the video, and I know there's been some comedians that put things up on this, but it's actually very true. The responses, that when I was talking to parents, I was going out to doors, and there was great engagement. And yes, there were some that, there were some parents that you were trying to, proactively intervene and support it, provide pastoral packs and different things. But the level of engagement and really the enthusiasm and willingness and almost the commitment that they were able to muster for was really, really impressive. And that was really for the conditions that we were in. We hadn't known what we were getting into. This time, from Christmas to now, people are really, really struggling. And I could tell you, and I've seen it pretty much across the board, and I would speak regularly with principals from other schools. So I know that it's a thing across different communities here. Parents are really struggling. They have to try to work at the same time. I've been in conversations, I've lost count of the number of times people have broken down crying to me on the phone, different things. And I have just had to, we introduce a Wellbeing Wednesday, just pull the curriculum and different things. You just have to tailor what you're trying to do to support parents. And the other thing about that is obviously this time, we were opened as a school throughout the first lockdown, but there was never more than a handful of children. Again, if you recall at that time, people were very, very worried about sending the children across the door. They just didn't want it. This time, I think maybe through the whole experience from March through to Christmas, and then obviously with their own work situation, I've had regularly now between 50 and 60 and children in the school. And a lot of that is me contacting them, a vice principal contacting through teachers, parents who we know are struggling, finding it very, very difficult. And we're saying, look, just send them in to us. We'll manage it. Just send them in for us. We'll do it. There's a social environment here with the key worker and vulnerable people's, supervision. And I think that I really think that, we need to get this one right, because the third one would be of that, of any similar length of time. I think people would find incredibly difficult. And I think that we would probably have to strip back even our expectations even further across the board. So I think that, that would certainly be a case for, whatever frustrations, and I would count myself amongst those who I just want the kids back in. I want them back as soon as possible in the school. And I know that that's what parents want, but there's a reason we've got to get this right, because we certainly do not want to be back to round 3 of this.
And there's a mental health impact on that from both sides, because if a young person or a child sees their parents struggling so bad that their own mental health and well-being is starting to go down, that obviously has an impact on the entire family, and can be very distressing as well, can't it, for those young people, seeing that the impact that this is having on their parents.
Well, the parents' mental health is directly correlated to the child's mental health. The two are the same thing. So when a parent's stressed, the child's stressed. And what we've got here, again, evidence is so strong that those parents, and let's face it, most of them are mothers. It's the women who are bearing the brunt of this, and the mothers are homeschooling and trying to work at the same time, and it's not working. I would have dispensed with the term homeschooling a long time ago, and this sounds quite radical, but it's just not possible. It's a completely different relationship. The relationship that a teacher has with a child is different from the relationship a parent has with the child. Therefore, you can't expect to even go anyway to try and replicate that experience. So yes, give the kids some of the work to do if they're, but let's just get away from this idea that we can even try to follow curriculum at home that would be in any way close to the experience a child would get at school. The guilt alone at the start, and a lot of that was just people were on nearly like a high, and they were covering everything up and doing their best and baking banana bread and living their best lives and all that stuff, right? But
there was a lot of Joe Wicks went on in that first month, and I think that most parents would strangle Joe Wicks if they got their hands on him at this stage.
I know, but it was lovely, and there was this lovely, we were in it together, we were clapping for cares, everybody was doing their bit. A year later, we can't sustain that, and it was never really possible. So I think we need to be honest and say there was very little homeschooling done, and no household has got this right. And the stress and pressure on adults' mental health is another reason why we should get schools back. And let's actually be honest about that. That's one of the benefits of getting children back in school as well, because we're protecting the adults. We know they're drinking more, and when adults drink, children suffer. That's the reality of it. So all of this stuff.
Stop looking at me when you're saying.
Look, for the most part, it's not a problem. But in many households, there are stressed parents who are tipping into their situations of neglect and abuse and things like that. And we know there's been a downturn in referrals to social services. There's been a downturn in admissions to accident and emergency departments for injuries and things like that. We know it's happening. It hasn't gone away. So there's been significant harm, again, caused by the schools being off. So I think we need to stop using phrases like homeschooling. I would move away from all of that and say we need to get the kids back. Although we have learned that a blended learning approach is possible. And we've learned about the importance of having Wi-Fi and having data and having devices, and that we can do some really good stuff with kids at home. So let's try and take the learning from that as we move forward. But we would never want to get into the situation where we have to try and do this homeschooling thing again. If anything, it's taught me lessons about, planning, about making sure that you change our school buildings so that you can do the social distancing, that we can have proper ventilation. If we were in America, we would have all this information about our local school, and we would know whether the children were safe and the possibility of transmitting the virus. Nothing like that happened. There's community centres that could have been used, and I know this is a huge task, but that's what really needed to happen so that we can get our kids back safely. And we should have been moving on this way before now, and I'm really concerned that nothing has been happening there. And we're not even talking really about getting teachers vaccinated. That's fundamental to all of this. That's the strategy we need, and we need to recognize that this is important, because what's happening now is harming children. That's the language that we need to use, because that's the reality of it.
We've been very slow. We've been very sorry about that, Alison. We've been very slow at times, and it is very frustrating. And I know that Tara would speak to this. So many students that were waiting here longer than in other jurisdictions to find out what was going to happen with their grades. Don't even get me started about the transfer test fiasco. I mean, God love the parents of P7, the current parents of P6 children. They don't know what situation they're going to face. One thing I would say is, you know, homeschooling, obviously that is a term pre-existed COVID, and it actually meant people maybe keeping their children at home. They were dedicating themselves to something, and almost lazily we lifted that and said, hey, everyone's now going to do homeschooling. The fear I have, and some people, and I have to commend them, some people went to incredible levels to make sure that everything a teacher was trying to send them, they did. I mean, I don't know how they did, because I know as a parent, I was in school every day. I certainly wasn't able to come home to my two, but I know this, the attainment gap has only widened as a result of the lockdowns. The difference now we're going to see is going to be, you know, what we talk about underachievement, we've gone back years because of this, because, you know, the households where school really does make a difference for the most. School was subbed out for the last year, really. And those children, and sometimes we could talk about data, we could talk about iPad provision, laptop provision, but it's much more than that. There's the social support, there's neglect issues. There's so many different things at play here. People who perhaps just don't have the skills. There's such a myriad of contributing factors. But the bottom line is that the summary is going to be that those children are going to require so much additional support. And I do think then the focus is going to be on saying to Stormont and other jurisdictions, the likes of what we had this year was called an engaged program. And I think it did work very well. But we need a commitment that, I don't want that to be a 1 year thing. I think we need a commitment that's a 3 year thing. We need to say, we need to be planning for that into the foreseeable future at primary and post-primary level, and working together almost to compare, disseminating best practice across fields, doing studies, say, well, what's working in one place? How can we share that? Because if it's this 9 month, I mean, when it was announced, you've got it until the end of March. Well, you know, you got it at the end of March, and then we're going to put a bid in to see if we can get money for 3 months. We need a commitment at Stormont to say, no, we're sacrificing other things. We're going to put this for 3 years, and we're going to put the onus on schools to show how are you using this to make a difference for those children.
Yeah, it's hard. There's a lot of that feeds into what I'm going to ask you. This is a question that was sent in where someone is saying that their predicted teacher grades this year, will they put them at a disadvantage against students who set their exams in previous years? We know how the predicted grades were worked out last year. This year, because people have been at home for so long, I think a lot are very worried about what those predicted grades will mean, and also how will they be viewed alongside candidates whose grades existed pre-COVID. And sort of, I think that the thing when I've been speaking to people they're really worried about, I know one of my friend's sons is due for university this September. He hasn't set a formal exam since his GCSEs. He's had no exam since then at all. Are they even mature enough socially to be moving off into university, given the fact that they haven't been in school for that length of time? Do the young people you speak to worry that this sort of class of 2020, 2021 will be at a disadvantage, not just when it comes to, you know, third level learning, but it comes to a plan for jobs, when it comes to a plan for apprenticeships? Do they think, are they concerned that they will be viewed lesser than their counterparts who maybe managed to get through school before this happened?
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely a concern. It's something like my you know, I can speak to the school students who express those concerns about, you know, if they even go to university, what is the experience even going to be? You can have the concerns about exams and whether you're academically ready. There are so many facets as to concern people about if they're actually capable of making that move yet. The socialization factor and the academic factor. And I know even for myself, my undergraduate degree was in law, and something that was a massive component of me doing my undergrad was the big final exam at the end that were able to determine whether your degree was a qualifying law degree or not. And the students last year who were finishing their law degree weren't able to sit those big exams. So where does that leave them if they're applying for legal jobs? How does that work if they haven't sat the exams? They're meant to prove that they have a qualifying law degree and they've got predicted grades instead. You know, it's quite a strange set of circumstances. And you're saying about your friend's son. For myself, again, I know I'm speaking in my own background, but it's because I also have lived the experiences that I'm hearing from other young people, which was I finished my master's degree, I got my results in December, and something to me that was widely unfair about university students having to try and the same level of attainment that would be expected in any other year. Last year's cohort of students, the class of 2020 and the ones graduating in the winter there, were expected to produce dissertations and to produce coursework the last time I was in the Queen's Library was the 6th of March, which is the day the first case was announced in Queen's. And I didn't get back in to start researching for my dissertation until the 20th of July. I only got a 2-week extension. And to me, that's very indicative of how students are being expected to perform to the same standard with little to no guidance as to how to get there. And the tools just aren't being given to be able to meet those standards. And I seen actually a very strange place to quote something from Twitter. To echo something that Siobhan said earlier on about being able, you can't be expected to meet that level of attainment. And it was in 10 to 20 years, we're going to look back at this experience and be absolutely appalled that there was the expectation of the same level of performance from parents who are working from home and homeschooling, from children sitting transfer tests, and from university students who haven't been taught in person at this point since last year, and even for students from last year as well. There's an element that's been forgotten as well in university students completing their degrees, which was the COVID-19 pandemic happened straight off the back of university strikes. So that there was a period of time where, you know, we talk about as if university teaching stopped from March onwards. Students in universities weren't being taught from as far back as November. And that's indicative again of university management on a high level not being able to they aren't giving students the tools. They also weren't paying staff to do this kind of work. And there's a real structural problem here of how that knowledge and those tools are disseminated down, because we've not seen people concerned, even if they get their degree, will their degree hold the same weight when they're applying for jobs? And even at that, there's going to be this gap now. If there are no jobs and then we roll into another year of lockdowns, they're not going to be the fresh new graduates anymore. There's going to be a whole new cohort coming after them. And really,
we actually got to sit in a classroom, so that's the concern, isn't it? That, you know, I think I can't remember at my age, it's a long time from anyone asked me what my exam results were, but I mean, when I, you know, when we had planned for jobs in my 20s and early 30s, they would have always asked what my exam results were, and I'm sure like that could follow you into your later life if they would be worried our employers going to look at this and say, well, they were predicted, I don't even know what that, you know, and go for somebody else instead. How long is this going to follow these young people around for, you know, how long in their lives are they going to have to deal with the fact that they were the pandemic children? You know, they were the ones who suffered through this.
Any jobs I've been applying for lately, I lost my job. I was working in a production company and I was let off because of COVID back in September. And any jobs that I was applying for, thankfully I was able to land firmly on my feet, which is something I'm quite aware I was privileged to be able to do. But even at that, like any applications I've been doing, they ask for your GCSEs and A-levels and they ask you to list what you got. And I'm sure for students, even people who aren't going to university, but school leavers who want to apply for jobs, where does that leave them?
Everything. Yeah, you can imagine, you know, if you're trying to apply for an apprenticeship, if you're trying to apply to a big company for one of their, you know, apprenticeship schemes, how are you going to be viewed, you know, as the children from this year? And I picked up on something that Chris said earlier about we already had a big gap in terms of educational underachievement, and that gap is very clear between those who have and those who live in areas of social and economic deprivation. And what I have been writing about, and what I've thought that COVID showed, the disparity in the world's wealth and the disparity in our wealth, when we talked about underlying conditions, and poverty was an underlying condition of COVID. We know that because we know from the postcodes of the people who died, whether they be in England, whether it be here, whether it be in America, that those who were the poorest were the ones who suffered most. And those children who live in areas, and I'm thinking, you know, kids who were trying to, maybe older children trying to do their schoolwork, while also becoming childcare for their younger siblings because there's no schools open and their parents have to go out to work, and taking on all of those roles. I think there's, you know, as you say, how do we even begin to try and close that gap, Chris, when you think about what those young people have endured? Children who were maybe working off a phone because they didn't have a laptop, you know, children who didn't have proper Wi-Fi or didn't have enough data to get their homework done. I know that, you know, one person told me that a child in their school apologised for the amount of mistakes in their work and saying they were working off a phone with a broken screen, and that was all they had to do their work from. All of those issues, and if you think about that compared to a child who maybe had a nice comfortable home with a laptop and Wi-Fi and two parents helping them, I mean, you can see a massive gap that's going to exist, and we're going to be dealing with that for years, aren't we, trying to mop up the mess that's created?
No, that's not going to go away. It's only going to be exacerbated at the moment. And I think, I mean, I would have children, VPRS children who came across from Syria. Now, those children were in for a period of months learning the language, which is so important. They need to be able to communicate with other children. And we've actually we've been bringing them back in every day, because if you cut that off, those children are going to be going home. They're not going to be speaking the language that they need to communicate in our environment, you know, providing resources. And to be fair, you know, today I just had 8 Chromebooks arrive to give out to more children. Now, we've been quite lucky that way. And you know, one of our neighbours who's Malone Integrated, they were giving away computers, fantastic, and they'd already given, and no one else in their school community wanted them. So I was able then to get more, and these were given away to keep. Whereas obviously through the government system, it's, you know, you're loaning out the likes of the Chromebooks and bringing them back in. But schools have been, you know, we've already been given other iPads and the like out. But really, you know, it's on so many levels. It's whether the parents have a capacity to support the child with the learning. That's already a gap. Whether parents are struggling for reasons beyond academic, whether socially, emotionally they have difficulties, other problems within their life, whether there's 3, 4, 5 children in the house fighting over the one iPad that that they have in the household. There are so many different things that are going on. And that's why I think we what do we learn from this? The children need to be in school. The learning, the only chance that we have to provide every child with the same opportunities in life is to make it through the social interaction that goes on peer to peer and teacher to child in a school environment. That's number one. Number two, then we need to commit over the coming years, not 1 year, the coming years, to put together a program of support which is surgically directed at schools identifying those they regard as needing the most support, whether it's pastoral or academic, because the two are interlinked. You know, you're not, one thing you'll have in schools so much now, schools over the last number of years, and it's a great thing at primary level, schools now will almost all will have nurture rooms as opposed to nurture units. They're much smaller units, but nurture rooms and sensory rooms. And, you know, we know that these are going to be, you know, used throughout the day by children as we try to transition back into school, because they need to be regulated. They need to be, you know, in order to be conducive to learning, they need to be in the right frame of mind. So we need to have that commitment at a government level. What I also think, and is something you mentioned there, Alison, and it does make me angry. And sometimes I do get angry in these things, but, you know, you made the point earlier, it's very easy for demonized students. It's very easy at times to identify areas and saying, oh, look what's going on in those communities, there's higher levels. Invariably, those tend to be the areas where people are having to get up and get the bus to work or the black taxi to work. They're going to places like Tesco or Sainsbury's, working in the shops, the petrol stations that never closed. That might, throughout one day, there might be over 1,000 people walking into a supermarket, and probably more than that. And they're maybe working 12-hour shifts. Of course, there's going to be higher levels of prevalence within those communities than likes of me, who can just travel in a car from A to B, who can try to stay in a confined zone. And, you know, it's something, and it's like I made the point earlier, it's like the way students have been. Very easy for people who live more comfortable lifestyles to, you know, criticize and speak in a patronizing way, not realizing that life isn't unfair and some people have it much more difficult than they do.
Actually, 2 points.
Sorry, go ahead. I know I've said it. I mean, I know how lucky I am. My job I can do from home. I have had a very comfortable lockdown. Once upon a time, I was, you know, single mother, teenage Allison, living in a flat, you know, in a council flat. And I certainly wouldn't have had the same lockdown if I was the person I was then that I do now. You know, they're two very different lives. And I realised that there are many people living just like the way I lived then, you know, and how they coped during this, because poverty is such a big factor of this lockdown. And also I know, you know, people who maybe had to work in Tesco or worked as cleaners and they had no childcare, they're leaving a 15 or 16-year-old, you know, child to carry out childcare and mind younger siblings because there's nowhere else to send them. And that, what are we doing? We're expecting 15-year-olds to educate themselves, do their own work, educate their younger siblings as well, while their, you know, mothers probably come back dog tired after being on their feet all day. And how do you expect that? That is very different from the experience of some children who will, you know, be fine, and some parents who I think will suffer. And Siobhan, in terms of mental health, poverty and mental health, I mean, the two things you can see, the links, we know there's high rates of mental health problems within my community, within West Belfast, and that's directly linked to the fact that we're post-conflict and an area of higher economic deprivation, isn't that correct?
Yeah, all of the evidence around the world shows us that adversities in childhood predict your mental health for the rest of your life. And the biggest adversity is in Northern Ireland is poverty. It's the social determinants of mental health are there. They're very clear. We've known about them for years. And we need a joined up approach across the government. If we really want to tackle mental health and mental illness, we actually need to try and eradicate poverty. And that's a significant challenge. And it's a message that I'm trying to get across as mental health champion. You know, every meeting I have with every minister, I emphasise that their department has a big role to play because the social determinants are there. And this is going to go on for years. Chris is absolutely right. It is going to go on for years, and it needs that long-term approach. But it needs a long-term approach anyway, because we still have all of those underlying factors, all of the adversities, the deprivation, the fact that leads to the mental illnesses that we're talking about. You know, so it is about early intervention and getting in early. I think there's a couple of good initiatives though that are happening. The framework that was announced for schools last week is positive. You know, it's an acknowledgement that every school in Northern Ireland needs to have a programme of work around mental health and well-being, and there's millions being invested there to make sure that we do all of that resilience work and early identification of young people who are engaging in patterns of behaviour that might indicate their risk later on, and getting them to the right sources of help. But you know, this is about teacher training as well. It's about that curriculum, and it's also about the curriculum for our teenagers, our adolescents, because they're the parents of the future, and they need to know that how they engage with their children and that relationships in those early years are really important to the next generation's mental health too. So it's always that cycle, and I call it transgenerational trauma, but it's really how trauma and mental illness in an adult affects their relationship with their child and then creates adversities for the child. But the social conditions are important too, you know, and our leaders have a role to play. What I'd be really worried about though, and we haven't talked about it, is all the data coming through that our young people are losing hope. You know, they think things will never be right again. And we haven't mentioned Brexit either. The opportunities to travel, the opportunities to study in Europe, all of that was taken away from our young people at the same time as this pandemic. And a lot of the young people are saying if they can get out of Northern Ireland, they will go and they will not come back. And that's been a problem for a very, very long time before COVID. And I would be worried that that's actually what we're facing into now, unless we get things right for this generation.
Yeah, get an Irish passport, kids. I'll sign it for you. So if that's what you just want to go traveling, never worry. I've got a really good question here, Tara, which I'm going to put to you that someone has sent through. Could we see a greater partnership between formal educators and the informal education sector, which included youth providers? And I know that recently I was speaking to someone who works in the community, and they're saying the lack of youth provision and the lack of that outside youth provision during this pandemic has been really problematic for a lot of young people, because obviously that was the release from maybe the pressures from home, and also those youth working settings are who maybe can pick up when a child is struggling or when a young person's struggling and when their mental health struggling. The youth worker or whatever youth group they're involved in, somebody would have seen that. Whereas if they're at home and they're not taking part in those facilities, are they slipping through the gaps and no one's recognising when they are struggling a bit?
I mean, something that I'm very passionate about is the fact that informal education, i.e. youth workers, do the donkey work of sort of like personal development in young people. And you've mentioned that role of, you know, where young people go where they have a release. Something else is really critical. You mentioned that young people kind of, they're in vulnerable situations. Youth work settings can be absolute lifelines for young people that are vulnerable. And vulnerable young people, again, it all links in. Young people with mental health issues, youth work settings can be absolute lifelines. I know from my experience being involved in the Northern Ireland Youth Forum, there's an open door policy. Any young person can just walk in, get a cup of tea, have a chat, have a biscuit. And that could be, for some young people, the most significant bit of socialization they'll have in a day. Or they can be some of the most formative relationships. That the relationship between a young person and a youth worker can kind of be life-changing. It can really kind of help center some young people. And the inability of youth workers at the moment, by no fault of their own, to be able to provide those one-on-one contact services is very, very detrimental in the long run for some young people who depend on that for giving them some stability in their life. And again, you know, I know in the Youth Forum, they've been involved in issues that are of very personal nature to young people, and that they have been able to advocate on their behalf for things that are, you know, for housing or for loads of different issues in all the young people's lives. And that informal education setting, it's so crucial. But there's actually a couple of points I wanted to mention earlier on, just in relation to other things that were said earlier. about the socioeconomic factors that can really exacerbate the impact of the pandemic on young people. And we've heard about transgenerational trauma, absolutely. And we've heard about refugees as well. My role is an all-island role. I'm talking for ones up in Derry as much as I'm talking for ones down in Cork. And something that keeps coming up is, we've heard about refugee young people in something like direct provision, who are the most vulnerable young people you're really going to get, and that they're having to try and shepherd people out of the shared accommodation bunks so they can do online learning, or that other people are kind of having to switch off their phones so there's enough Wi-Fi for one child to be able to engage with online learning. There's that many factors as to how there's those barriers to taking part in things, and they're really massive. I know if you say direct provision, you think it's a relatively small portion of the population, but that's still a significant amount of people who are really falling through the cracks. And particularly for somebody who has English as a second language, you know, how further behind are you expected to fall? And again, I want to pay tribute to a community organisation. I'm from the Lower Falls, all my ones come from Clonard, and there's a group called the Clonard Area Homepage. It is not government funding. It's literally just men around the door trying to help people. And to me, they did more significant work than I've seen a lot of, you know, high up departments do, because they were able to provide something like 70 laptops for local people around the doors, because those young people and their parents couldn't afford the technology to be able to take part in online learning. And that is an example of a success story in the middle of this, of a local community initiative that was able to make that level of difference. But in a lot of places, that community cohesion isn't there, and people are just completely falling through the cracks and they aren't able to take part in the same way online. I know that wasn't really the question you asked me, but I wanted to make sure that I gave a shout out to the Clonard group, because to me it's a real example.
Yeah, I think that I've been, you know, it's brought out the good and the badness, and you know, you can see where people have really risen to a challenge and where others have, you know, maybe not you know, portrayed themselves in the best of light. But that community sector, that voluntary sector, you know, the food banks, the people, as you say, who were fundraising, giving money and giving laptops out to the young children, who were, you know, making sure that old people were being visited, and those people. And can we just say that while we're here, a lot of young people were involved in that work and doing homeless outreach and all sorts of other things while dealing with everything else that was going on. And they're like the heroes, you know, of this pandemic. Those people who, you know, stood up and helped their community. I think it did give me hope in the darkest days, because there's days we're both, but those especially those working class communities who stepped up to the plate and helped people, I think, you know, have done us proud. And it's something that when we look back we should feel good about, because there's not much really to feel good about with this pandemic. We're going to really probably get one more question, and it's someone for all of you, and it was a question that was sent in, and I want to hear from all the panelists to say what can be done in the immediate future to support children and young people as we look towards a school restart. So as we prepare to bring them back, whether it's in phase bringing them back, or is everyone going to go back in September altogether as normal, or whatever's happening, that has created so much anxiety and everything. As you say, some people are terrified to leave the house at some stage, or they're afraid to go back into that social setting. I'll start with you, Chris, and move my way around. How can we very immediately support those young people and prepare them for that transition back to school life?
Well, I think that's already happening. I mean, from next Monday, we're going to have the youngest ones, the nursery, primary 1, 2, and 3, which is great. I know it. I mean, that's only going to be at the moment only 2 weeks, and I really, really am hopeful that the executive will revisit that. And please God, you know, if things are okay, I think they're going to review it on March 16th. Because I just think if we bring those kids back for 2 weeks and then send them away out again for a week and a half, we're kind of taking a step back again. So I think if we can get those children back and they're looking forward, then they're in for 3.5 weeks, depending on the school, but before Easter, they're almost back into that groove. They're back with their friends. They're back in that environment. It's what we do as adults is we manage that process to make sure it's not just get back in the classroom, back, you know, things, you got to go back through the gears with children. You got to look after the most important things, the social, the connection, getting their friendships right, making them feel comfortable in that environment. Schools, well, I mean, I said to you earlier, we'll have extra play sessions, structured play, we'll have extra gardening, PE sessions. Schools will be doing that, music, art, whatever. I just, before you go to somebody else, because I don't want to miss out on this one, because I know that a lot of the things have been focusing on, I don't want to say negatives, but necessarily, but I do think it is really, really important to say this. You know, we talked about students and maybe how people in future might look at their qualifications in a way and think less of. I think the opposite. I think we should be looking at those children as the heroes, resilient heroes who came through, who had to sit through a period of time. Look at those P7s, for God's sake. They had to sit and think that they were going to do the test right through Christmas, for goodness sake. They're still going. Look at the children up at GCSE A level. Look at the children going through university. They're not having those early university experiences I had. I don't remember all of them, and you know why, for goodness sakes, because that's what the first year in university tend to be like. But the point
I'm just glad there was no social media when I was a young person,
exactly.
or I would be unemployable.
Exactly. But the point is, they're still going. And I think that's so important that we should be celebrating. Now, I know I'm giving all of my kids this year special class of 21 certificates, and we're going to have graduation ceremony for all the kids in the school, and the P7 is a special one. And I think schools need to be thinking that way. We need to tell these kids they were heroic for keeping on going, and they're our number one priority after all, getting them right and helping them progress from here.
And Tara, yeah, as we prepare the young people that you're talking to, what could you do immediately to get them ready for that transition back to school life?
Big combination. One, I really agree with what Chris said, and about providing that level of stability for young people come back into school, that we try and create a situation where they're not having to get like pulled back in and put back out again and back in and out and out. And something that I think, Siobhan earlier on really, saliently talked about the role of the teacher in children's lives and that connection. And to me, I think you need to start with something really basic, which is if we're going to have children having stability in schools and being content in schools, you need to get vaccinating the teachers, because that trickles down. If teachers are concerned about being in school and there is that worry of the infection spreading while you're there, teachers deserve that.
Caretakers and the dinner staff, the whole lot.
Classroom assistant, caretaker, all of those guys.
Yeah. My brother's an SEN primary teacher, and he still hasn't been vaccinated. He's been in right through, because some of the kids that he works with need to have that level of stability in the schools. And I think if we want to have contented children, you need to have contented teachers and people working with them. And to do that, you need to provide them a level of safety and a security net, that if they're going in and they're going to work with kids who have already had a rough year, that they're protected and safe doing so. So I think that's something we need to work on in the immediate.
Yeah, and Siobhan, especially I think it's the fear, I think, and the anxiety. I mean, I could see the impact. My wee granddaughter's an only child, and in the first lockdown had a very comfortable home and a big massive garden and all of that. But when the first lockdown ended and I took her to park, she was running around it like a drunk in the smoking area of Thompson's going, "Hello, would you be my friend? Please, will you speak to me?" Because she was completely unsocialized because she hadn't been with another child in so long. So how do you get those children ready for that? Because mentally, I think it's really difficult for them to imagine to be in a crowd again, considering they've been on their own for so long.
That is a brilliant analogy, and I will be using that.
She was running up to complete strangers and going, "Your dress is lovely. Will you be friends with me?" And I said to my daughter, "You think that child was like drunk in a bar crying, asking everyone
I'd be friends with
her." My child hasn't seen me with other people, so she can't handle me. If I have to do a face-to-face conversation, she moves my face because she's not used to splitting my attention in any way, shape, or form, because she hasn't seen me with other people socially. It's always just me and her, and then she's the childminder. So anyway, right, let's go back to the data for a second. Young people were much more lonely than older people, and there were more younger people lonely than there were older people through this whole pandemic. So let's acknowledge that as well. The evidence is there that this group were disadvantaged. And I have nothing to add to the other suggestions. Let's celebrate what they did, find a way of thanking them, give them something really special to look forward to in the summer. And let's start planning all the formals, all the parties, all the birthday parties. Let's get the bookings in the diary, and let's get confidence from our leaders that they've got this and that they're going to vaccinate our teachers and get those adults regulated and they're happy coming back, and then our children will be okay. And we do need to dial up the mental health services to make sure that the minute we spot a child, or a child comes to us with a sign that something has happened or they're in difficulty, we need to be tuned into that and get them to the right source of help straight away. And that's then what was going to leave us with a really resilient bunch of young people, and we'll be thanking them for many, many years to come.
And that's us, and just all there is to say is thank you to our panel. I know that I have been on panels and spoken to Chris on many occasions and spoken to you before, Siobhan, but can I also say how impressed I have been by Tara. You're just such a good advocate for young people. Honestly, I think that we're all probably going away. I'm thinking about all the things I'm going to use you for and interview you for in the future now. I haven't done that. So thank you to our panel, but also thank you to the Executive Office, Together Building United Communities, Good Relations Department for supporting this. You can tell I just read that off something, can't you? For supporting this event, and for further Féile events. If you just go on to the Féile and Phobal website, you'll be able to see there's a whole host of other talks and discussions and events taking place during the Spring Festival. Thank you so much for all your time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.